hear me? Okay, thank you. So I would like to thank Professor Jerry Murray for inviting me to be here. And I also would like to thank all the organizations and individuals on this campus to make this talk possible. So I'm very happy to be here, and I'm very grateful that people come here to hear my talk. So this is quite a new project, so I would appreciate if you could give me feedback or aspects that you want to know more. So the title of this talk is The Cultural Revolution and Diasporic Trauma in Hong Kong 1968 to 1970. So this talk focuses on the cross-border movements in the 1960s. So first of all, maybe we should look at the historical background of border crossing between China and Hong Kong. So as many of you may know, 1949 is when the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, took over China, mainland China, the PRC, the People's Republic of China. And then this is also when the Kuomintang, the KMT, moved to Taiwan. So, and then Hong Kong was returned to the British as it was a British colony. So, so that's the kind of the situation there. So from the early 1950s to the early 1980s, it has been estimated that more than 2 million people crossed the border from China to Hong Kong. Because the Hong Kong government closed off the border in 1950 to prevent communist infiltration, most migrants had to sneak into Hong Kong illegally. Many of them fled mainland China because of political upheavals, including the Great Leap Forward, the famine, and the Cultural Revolution. Some went to Hong Kong because they imagined the city to be a place of political freedom and easy opportunities to get rich under British colonial rule. So the majority of the ones who managed to reach Hong Kong eventually settled down and became the first generations of Hong Kongers. That's how we call them today. But many also passed through Hong Kong and migrated to other places such as Taiwan, Southeast Asia, and North America. Most people escaped to Hong Kong through the Shenzhen-Hong Kong border. So if you look at this map here, this part is mainland China, and below this line is Hong Kong. So this is the Shenzhen-Hong Kong border, where most people used to escape. So, so this is a photo that of the Shenzhen border today. So there's still barbed wire kind of preventing people from crossing. And these are two photos of the Lowwu River. So many people had to swim across the Lowwu River to get to Hong Kong. So so here is 2011. So you see all these tall buildings. That's Shenzhen, because after they developed Shenzhen. So it used to be like this, and then they had to cross over to Hong Kong. So that's one way of crossing over to Hong Kong. An alternative to that were various water routes on the western and eastern sides of Hong Kong, where sampan boats were hired for passage into Hong Kong or Macau. Some attempted swimming with improvised flotation devices. So, this is the western route. They usually swim from this place called Shekou to Hong Kong here, so it's not very far. Or some of them might swim from this side. So these are the western and eastern sea routes. So how much trouble was it to go through the border? To travel from the locality, one had to have the household registration and then get a mainland transit pass from the Public Security Bureau. So it's not so easy when you talk about the 1950s and 1960s for people to just travel within China. So first they need the mainland transit pass from the Public Security Bureau to get from one province to another. And once that was obtained, people made their way to the border via any affordable means. And from there, some people made a land crossing. Depending on the time period, sometimes the PRC officials would be guarding the border and arrest anyone who tried to cross it. Usually, when some political or natural disasters happened, there would be high numbers of people in Shenzhen waiting to cross the border. One former refugee described his situation when he tried to escape in 1961. Because China had a 3-year-long big famine, that was right after during the Great Leap Forward, and there was a famine, so there was the failure of the Great Leap Forward. All of Shenzhen, that one street was definitely filled with people standing and sitting. Like during the day, people had to wait for nightfall to cross the border. Yeah, the British authorities would arrest you, the English side, this side, other than English soldiers. There were a lot of Pakistani mercenaries, right? They were called, the Gurkha soldiers. So avoiding authorities at the border was not the only danger, as there was also plainclothes police stationed in various parts of the new territories. In fact, a person coming in from the mainland China without documentation could still be arrested in the new territories and sent back to China. So we see people the police arresting them and then maybe sending them back to China. And only when they reached the city center of Kowloon were they considered safe. So this is a road map drawn by a former refugee of how do you escape to Hong Kong. But instead of looking at the land border, because many people are quite familiar with that, and many people know about Shenzhen, this presentation actually focuses on the relationship between people and the sea borders of Hong Kong. In particular, it examines incidents happened between 1968 and 1970 within the territorial waters of Hong Kong, because that was the height of the Chinese Cultural Revolution. During this time, many dead bodies were found in Hong Kong sea territories, and some people who worked in the sea or coastal areas were kidnapped to Shenzhen. By examining these events, I hope to shed light on the effects of the Cultural Revolution on the people in the British colony. So oceans or seas are often depicted as a type of natural borders that separate territories. Yet the waters surrounding Hong Kong not only serve the purpose of separating China and Hong Kong, they also played the following functions in history. First, the seas on the western and eastern sides of Hong Kong were two of the 3 most popular routes of escape for people who fled the PRC from the 1950s to the early 1980s. In other words, they are channels for traveling. Second, the water, especially the lower Pearl River area, connected to the sea territories of Hong Kong, was a convenient place to dump the unwanted. Sometimes corpses were thrown into the Pearl River and were then washed into the seashores of Hong Kong and Macau. Third, the sea was the workplace for fishermen, oystermen, and other coastal communities on both sides of the border. And lastly, sea borders were good locations for kidnapping, piracies, and other crimes because they were areas not actively patrolled by governments on either side of the border. So this is a photo image of the area called Lau Fau San in Hong Kong, and I'll be talking about this area later on in my talk. So after the refugees arrived in Hong Kong, how did they feel? A number of articles submitted to newspapers and magazines in the 1950s and early 1960s uttered a sense of loneliness and strandedness in this border zone between the the PRC and Taiwan. As one writer explained, because Hong Kong is located between the mainland and Taiwan, on the one hand, its free atmosphere makes people feel warm and fuzzy. But on the other hand, it is still not a place where they belong. For many people, all they can think about is how and when is this life of homelessness going to end? Another letter echoed this frustration. The writer said, "We cannot go back to the mainland and we cannot enter Taiwan. Then should we jump into the sea and drown ourselves?" Many others of similar situations use the term Gudao, or lonely island, when they refer to Hong Kong. By calling Hong Kong a Gudao, or lonely island, the writers highlighted the political isolation of the city after the communists took over the mainland, as well as the sense of loneliness. At the same time, Gudao, or lonely island, can remind them that Hong Kong was the opposite of Taiwan, which was known as Baodao, or the island of treasure. And that's usually the destination, where the desired destination of many of these refugees. There was also a constant struggle about whether to return to China or stay in Hong Kong in the 1950s. One contributor to a magazine says, 3 years ago, many people in Hong Kong wanted to return to China, and there were rumors that the CCP might not be so bad. So the ones who had stayed in Hong Kong for an extended period of time yearned to go back to check it out. Today, people in Hong Kong would only go back to the mainland if the CCP is ousted, or else they would rather stay in this lonely island. The people who had arrived in Hong Kong in the 1950s, they continued to be affected by the political events in China in the late 1960s. In an editorial article titled Observing Mainland China and Taiwan from Hong Kong, published in Kuomintang-affiliated newspaper Gongshan Ribao on October 15, 1968. The author writes, "In the big exodus in 1962, thousands of people crossed over the rivers and mountains and escaped to Hong Kong. Before they could catch their breath, the Mao faction started the Red Guards movement, and the relatives of the migrants were the first victims. Many had family members publicly humiliated, and some could not bear the persecution and committed suicide. The Hong Kong migrants saw these disasters, yet they could not find anyone to help them, and they cried until their tears were dried up. From then on, the mainland had many armed struggles and people were dying. But before they could calm down and wipe off their tears, they witnessed floating bodies coming to Hong Kong nonstop. From these incidents, we can see how deep of a grudge that Hong Kong people hold against the Mao regime, and how much they are worried about the chaos in the mainland, as well as how anxious they are while waiting for Taiwan to save the country." So this author situates the influx of dead bodies within the context of Hong Kong's ties with the mainland, and argues that political events in the mainland, mainly the Cultural Revolution and the violent struggles in Guangdong, had been taking a toll on Hong Kong residents' emotional health. Even though the dead bodies were not those of people from Hong Kong, the reports of deaths generated a great deal of anxiety about the relative safety in China. The author also alluded to Taiwan as the only possible savior for these Hong Kong residents. So between early 1950s and mid-1960s, many pro-Kuomintang newspapers, as well as publications by the Kuomintang-sponsored Refugees Relief Association, reported high numbers of dead bodies found in the sea territories near Hong Kong. So here are some examples. On March 8, 1952, over 50 male bodies were found near Daya Bay. That's the location where they have the nuclear plant right now, but at that time it's an electric plant. So these were, the male bodies were belonged to construction workers suspected to be killed by the communists because they might have leaked state secrets. On July 28, 1956, one male body was found near Macau. He allegedly attempted to flee from China because of his discontent with the political situation, but was shot down during his escape. On August 21st, 1957, 30 dead bodies were found by fishermen when they tried to escape to Hong Kong by boat, but the boat was capsized. And on December 2nd, 1964, a woman was found drowned near Lantau Island. He went on a boat to come to Hong Kong from Macau because he was too anxious to wait for the permit of entry after her husband had settled in Hong Kong, and she was told that her husband had a mistress. So these are just a few of the examples of dead bodies, the discovery of dead bodies reported on newspapers. These dead bodies were escapees or refugees who had drowned themselves while swimming or taking a boat across the eastern or western sea territories of Hong Kong. Or they had been shot dead by the mainland authorities or the People's Liberation Army and thrown into the Pearl River. These anti-communist media portrayed these escapees, dead or alive, as victims of great disasters under the CCP. The reports of dead bodies reminded some of the people in Hong Kong about their perilous journeys that they themselves had taken to escape to Hong Kong, and confirmed their frightening speculation about the brutality of the CCP in mass murdering innocent victims. So in the summer of 1968, between June 22nd and the end of August, the number of dead bodies found in Hong Kong sea territories spiked. So between those 2 months, over 100 bodies were found in the territories of Hong Kong and Macau. So on this newspaper report, it says between 17 days, the first 17 days from June 22nd to July 10th, there were over 60 bodies. And 34 of them were discovered in the sea territories of Hong Kong and 26 within the sea territories of Macau. So, so this is, you can't really see very clearly here, but then these things, like kind of dark things lying around, they're actually dead bodies. There will be a few more clearer images. So just want to give you an idea. So the dead bodies were found concentrated. The dead bodies that were found in that summer concentrated in the western sea territories of Hong Kong. So many fishermen who worked in Lau Fau San area, Yuen Long, found them while they were out in the sea. So, so I have created this map here. So these dots are the areas where the dead bodies were found. So this corner here is Lau Fau San, which I'll talk about, and many of them were found in this area, but they're also here, and then this is Macau, and then somewhere here, right? So since refugees, they travel through the western and eastern routes, right? So we wonder why in this summer only in the western sea territories were these dead bodies found. So in a report published in Gongshang Ribao on June 27, 1968, titled Dead Bodies Gushing in from the Mainland, the reporter further described the conditions of the corpses discovered in the sea or along the coastline. 90% of the corpses discovered on the sea are incomplete and unrecognizable. They have no names on them, and nobody knows who their parents, siblings, or relatives are. For their clothes, they are sometimes wearing communist military uniforms, and some were wearing liberation outfit, others just look like regular civilians. This indicates that they died perhaps during the factional struggle, the culprit behind all these murders is the greatest evil, Mao Zedong. So because Gongshang Ribao is a Kuomintang affiliated newspaper, they would say that it's because of the Communist Party or Mao Zedong. That's why they died. Another report says this. Occasionally, they also wore badges of Mao Zedong. The majority of them were men in their 30s. The women who were found sometimes wore flowery outfits. They were probably victims of the violent struggles during the Cultural Revolution. So between 1966 to 1969, millions of people were persecuted in the violent struggles that ensued across the country and suffered a wide range of abuses, including public humiliation, arbitrary imprisonment, torture, hard labor, harassment, seizure of property, and sometimes execution. So one report described the dead bodies found in late June. There was a girl about 14 or 15 of age. She had a rope on her neck. And other bodies all had bruises. Some were dismembered and some had wounds all over their bodies. Some were blindfolded with towels. It's unclear whether they were executed because they tried to escape or whether they were caught in the fight between the Mao camp or anti-Mao camp. On average, 8 to 9 bodies were discovered each day between late June and mid-August. Another report on June 25, 1968 drew similar conclusion. Since some of these bodies have both their arms tied up and others have wounds all over their bodies, it is fair to say that these bodies were either victims of violent struggles or they were executed by the Communist parties. So here are 2 images of, this is Hong Kong police looking at a dead body on the beach, and then somebody's trying to pull a dead body from the sea to the shore. So from some of the newspaper reports which try to trace the origins of the dead bodies in June and July 1968, we find out that there was severe flooding. And areas such as Zhaoqing, Sanshui, Xinhui, Taishan, Nanhai, Zhongshan, and Dongguan were inundated. That's why the dead bodies were so easily carried to Hong Kong Sea territories by the tide. And also the violent armed struggles were most serious in Guangzhou, Zhaoqing, and Yangon. So if you look at this map here, this is the area where the branches of the Pearl River are, and this area was inundated. And the violent armed struggles concentrated in this area. So that's why the dead bodies kind of, when they were thrown into the Pearl River, they were washed and then slowly moved downstream. The description of the dead bodies tell us something about the violent armed struggles in Guangdong during the Cultural Revolution. People in Hong Kong were able to find out that the political scene was very chaotic in Guangdong area and was very haunted by these stories and reports about dead bodies. So the rush of floating bodies in Hong Kong adds more details to public's understanding of the Cultural Revolution in China. The details complement what scholar Yang Su describes in his book, Collective Killings in Rural China During the Cultural Revolution. So this is Yang Su's book. Before Su's books, most previous studies of the Cultural Revolution focus on the urban Red Guards. So like what Su describes in his book, the Cultural Revolution was not just an urban phenomenon. His book describes how people classified as coming from bad class backgrounds were murdered in groups, often whole families at a time, in front of mass meetings. The slaughter was also especially intense in Guangdong and Guangxi, southern provinces with histories of clan conflict. According to Yang Su, between 400,000 and 3 million people were systematically exterminated in villages, but not at the hands of rampaging young red guards, and not as a result of genocidal state policy. Instead, the neighbors were killing neighbors. The situation in the province was chaotic and led to more and more people leaving for Hong Kong. Thus, the story of dead bodies and refugees in Hong Kong in the mid to late 1960s was very much a part of the story of the Cultural Revolution. So learning more about it should shed light on the violent struggles in the Guangdong region and complicate the history of China under Mao's rules. And we would learn more about the rural violent struggles through these dead bodies. As for the reason why dead bodies were only flowing on the western side of Hong Kong, the answer can be found in the report that describes how people died and how their bodies ended up in the sea. It says, because of the large numbers of deaths near the rivers, and other people were too lazy to bury them. So for convenience sake, they just threw these bodies into the rivers. The rising water then carried many of the bodies down the Zhujiang River to Hong Kong and Macau territories. So again, they were threw into the river, and then it was washed, and that's why they were found in the western side of Hong Kong and sometimes in Macau. So this is the area where the dead bodies concentrated. So at the same time while this was happening, the pro-Kuomintang organizations would use the news of floating bodies to continue its propaganda against the CCP. So this poster published by a Kuomintang-sponsored organization is a good example. So it says here, look at the horrible phenomena in China today. And then on the left side, we see children accusing their parents, purging them. And then the second one, it says inhumane treatment by taking away their food. And then the third one is a struggle session where people were killed. And then the fourth one is treating, we have the hand of the Communist Party kind of lifting up the people, so treating people like slaves. And then this one, there are these skulls here, and meaning death. So the communist dictatorship would result in a lot of deaths. The stories of dead bodies also appeared in other reports. People who traveled to and from China during the Cultural Revolution were often interviewed about why they were traveling to China or what they have seen in their hometowns. In 1967, Gongshang Wanbao interviewed a traveler going back to China at the Tsim Sha Tsui train station, where he was waiting for a train to Guangzhou. The title of that article was hearing that all his family members were killed and overseas Chinese risked his life to go back to his hometown to visit relatives. So the man who was interviewed said, one relative from mainland told me that all my family members in China were beaten to death or died in the armed struggles. But I don't know if it's true or not. But after seeing so many corpses in Hong Kong and Macau, I'm very worried and must go back to my hometown to check it out. The article mentions that his wife and wife were in China and he was by himself in Hong Kong. The relative who purportedly informed him about this was an old lady and was unable to provide more details. And then the man told the reporter that his family could be killed because they were suspected to be hiding surplus food in their house. There were also narrative accounts by people who came back from the mainland. A young woman said the problem of floating bodies in Hong Kong was not so serious. since he had witnessed something worse. He saw 20 people being drowned, being thrown into the river at once somewhere in China. And then a cook said he had witnessed a massacre on the street and heard sounds of bombs in Guangdong. He heard that one bomb landed in a residential area, and more than 10 houses collapsed, and many people lost their limbs. Another old woman from Heshan told a newspaper that her 16-year-old grandson was recruited to participate in the corpse retrieving groups, the Lao Shi Tuan, to look for dead bodies from the river. And another traveler from the mainland to Hong Kong said a few days ago, Nanhai residents were salvaging a piece of cedar in the ocean, but after pulling it out of the water, they were shocked to find that 7 bodies were nailed to the underside of that piece of log. So these accounts created a period of terror in Hong Kong, and it is also a part of the Cultural Revolution experience, but from the perspective of the people who witnessed the events in China and told their stories in Hong Kong. So Hong Kong became a window for people outside of the PRC to gain some access to what was happening during the Cultural Revolution in the mainland. So this is a photo I took last summer in a place called Shaling. So Shaling is an area on the Hong Kong side near the Shenzhen-Hong Kong border, the land border that is, where there are mass burials of people who have no relatives or whose identities are unknown. So this says Shaling, public burial site. So there in Shaling, you see these graves. So and then they are very messy, kind of everywhere, like all around the ground, and there's a lack of maintenance. So we don't know too much about how the Hong Kong government dealt with the large number of unidentified bodies found in the sea. A few newspaper reports mentioned that they were buried in Shaling Cemetery. So they're buried here, some of them. And in a pamphlet published by the Free China Refugees Association in 1979, so a decade after the summer where a lot of dead bodies were found. In that pamphlet, it states that one body was found every day on average throughout the 1950s to the 1970s. They were all buried in Shaling, and their identities were unverified. So on average, like before 1968 and after 1968, they're also dead bodies. So on average, between those 3 decades, there were about maybe 1 body found on average each day, and then they were all buried here. And there were no names on these tombstones, but only a number engraved on each one. Their real identities would remain a mystery permanently. Their only records were the brief description in the police file and the number assigned to each of them. So you can vaguely see a number on these graves. So this is what the pamphlet is talking about. So there's some numbers, and then that's it. And then you don't know who these people are. In the writings about dead bodies, we see conflicting feelings toward their home called China. An essay was published in the editorial of Gongshan Wanbao. The author believed that these homeless souls should at least get a proper place of burial and not to be sunk into the bottom of the ocean. His suggestion to the government was to record the clothes, the characteristics, and age of the dead on the tombstones. It would be better if the burial site faces Zhujiang, that's the Pearl River, and a tombstone of gazing the homeland, Wangxiangtai, is constructed for it. The purpose of this is to comfort these dead bodies' wishes in looking back at their homeland. So we have suggestion that we should build a pavilion so that they can face China after they died. But some refugees felt differently about this home called China. A note was found on one of the dead bodies, which writes, "If I encounter ill fortune and die, please don't tell my family in my hometown in China. Please bury my body in a land of freedom." So we have different imagination about where the dead souls should belong. And at the same time, the Kuomintang affiliated newspapers would not miss the chance of using dead bodies to criticize the CCP and the deeds of Mao Zedong. One commentator said that the Hong Kong authorities should use the floating bodies to prove to the world about Mao's crimes. Thus, the organizations and individuals concerned about this should request the Hong Kong authorities to set up the third Sunday of June as Day of Commemoration, because he or she argued most people in Hong Kong tended to be forgetful and they would not remember the communist disasters if there was no such reminder. Another writer wrote even more satirically. He said, if the barefoot doctors could resurrect people by chanting the Mao's red book according to the hearsays, the CCP could do the same to the dead bodies. After those dead bodies were revived, they could be put on trial and then executed in front of the public. That way, the CCP could use the remains to display to the public so that no one would dare to escape to Hong Kong anymore. So the crossing of the sea border highlights the ambiguous identities of some of the people who crossed the seas. During the Cultural Revolution, many people died in the violent armed struggles between factions in the Guangdong region, and the bodies were discarded in the rivers. The dead bodies then floated to Hong Kong. These former communist Red Guards or activists went through a transformation as their bodies crossed the border into Hong Kong Sea territories, from CCP activists to grotesque propaganda objects used by the Kuomintang to construct the narratives about the miserable lives under the CCP in mainland China. The dead bodies who were found in Hong Kong territories were often not identified. Their true identities and their past were lost permanently in the sea. It is also not sure whether these dead bodies, where these dead bodies should belong, whether they should go back to their hometowns in China, was not clear. And for the ones who died drowning in the escape journeys, perhaps to them, their home would be Taiwan or a future imaginary China, where the CCP was no longer ruling over the place. So fishermen and other people who worked in the sea had many direct encounters with refugees and dead bodies. A newspaper reported that one woman was thrown into the sea because she allegedly had helped escapees from China sneak into Hong Kong. Her sampan was first surrounded by more than 10 mainland yachts. And they were harassing her, and the people on those yachts yelled at her, calling her a traitor of the nation, 卖国贼. One motor yacht crashed into her boat, and the woman fell into the water and died. Some fishermen felt that because of this incident, if they continue to rescue these escapees or help them enter Hong Kong, they would put other fishermen at risk. Also, fishermen were usually the first ones to encounter the dead bodies. The newspapers in the 1960s reported how the large number of corpses threatened the lives and psychological health of the fishermen. One article titled Corpses Gushed into the Mouth of Zhujiang River described the horror felt by the fishermen from Hong Kong who witnessed the floating bodies, and many avoided them as fast as they could. Another article claims that because the vicinity was filled with corpses, fishermen were afraid to cast the net. And fishermen on the Chinese side of the sea border were affected too. The Communist Army in Zhongshan the Communist Army in Zhongshan rewarded 10 yuan for each corpse retrieved from the sea. However, since there were too many of them in 1968, the reward was set to reduce to 2 yuan per corpse. In addition, fishermen and oystermen were sometimes forced to attend regular meetings at the People's Communes run by CCP members in Shekou. So this is Hong Kong, and this is Shenzhen. So Shekou is this tip where many refugees escaped. So there was also a place where a theater where fishermen were told to go and attend meetings there. A 47-year-old fisherman testified that every time he went to Shekou to have meetings at the commune, he would see a leader on stage reciting the Mao's Little Red Book, and that leader would demand the crowd off the stage to follow him. That fisherman expressed that he was almost bored to death every time because he was illiterate. He often went to the toilet as an excuse to sneak out of these meetings. Cross-border kidnappings were also rampant during the Cultural Revolution. On July 1st, 1968, 50 fishermen were kidnapped by the communists from mainland China. They were put on a public hearing in the theater in Shekou. These fishermen were taken away from the coast of Baklai near Laofaoshan. According to a report to the Foreign Affairs Office of Kuomintang, the CCP officers said that they took the fishermen to mainland China to have a meeting and said that the fishermen would be returned in 3 days. But 47 of the fishermen were released back to Laofaoshan only after being detained for 6 days, and the rest a few weeks later. A number of them were beaten and suffered severe injuries. One 65-year-old fisherman told the reporter that he was put on trial and brainwashed. He was also forced to kowtow to the cadre and repent that he stole fish from them. The fisherman was enraged by the public humiliation since he had never been accused of stealing before. He declared that he would never go back to the sea again unless the Hong Kong authority could guarantee his safety. It was reported that the fishermen were indicted with the charges in the communes of helping illegal immigrants in entering the territories of Hong Kong. And they were allegedly fishing in the PRCC territories without approved fishing licenses from the commune. Another news article revealed that in order to get the license from the commune, each fishing boat would have to pay the monthly dues of 600 to 700 caddies of fish and attend philosophy classes at the commune. Other reports say that they were captured because they never voluntarily attended classes run by the CCP members in Shekou. Ultimately, these fishermen, this group of fishermen was let go after promising to attend meetings in the future and to surrender their daily catches to the CCP. However, there were some less fortunate ones. The case of Zhang Ngao and his sons was one of the greatest tragedies in Hong Kong during the years of the Cultural Revolution. Fishermen reported on September 1st, 1970, that a fishing junk anchored near an oyster bed on the Hong Kong shore of Deep Bay and 2 miles from Laofaoshan. According to the witness of the abduction, as reported in the South China Morning Post, about 20 people from the junk boarded to 2 sampans, sailed closer to the oyster bed, and forced 8 oyster farmers working there to board their fishing junk. As soon as they all got on the junk, it sailed off towards China. Among the victims were Zhang Ngao and his 2 sons. It was later found out that the father and the 2 sons were killed during their capture. Zhang Ngao was first shot and then stabbed to death because he resisted during the capture. His 20-year-old son attempted to escape by swimming furiously to the shore. He was then reportedly shot in the chest, beaten with poles, and had both of his arms chopped off at the wrist. And also he was disemboweled before he died. The youngest son, a 20-year-old, was severely beaten with wooden poles on a sampan and dumped on the pier. He was later taken to a stone hut where he died the following day. So these their bodies were all found were left on the shore near Laofao as a warning to others, and then they were later cremated. There was a rumor that the oystermen were captured and killed because they upset the Chinese communes for adamantly refusing to attend communist propaganda sessions in a village shack set up by the communes. The rest of the oystermen were brought back in their sampans a few days later, towed by a communist motor junk and released off Laofao in Deep Bay. People in Hong Kong expressed their concern that the abductions at Laofao could make the Hong Kong people lose confidence in the maintenance of law and order within the colony's territories. The Singdao Daily said that although this particular abduction incident was not the first of its kind, the incident was far more serious than the others. It feared that the violation of Hong Kong's territorial integrity by Chinese commune members to carry out their kidnapping would create uneasiness among the people about the maintenance of peace and order along the border. The newspaper hoped the Hong Kong government would act to reassure the people in the new territories that law and order would be upheld. Another newspaper, The Express, said the Hong Kong government must shoulder the responsibility for the freedom with which communists were able to intrude into Hong Kong territory and forcibly abduct people. Despite the protests and critiques in the media, there was not much change in government policies regarding the sea territories. The cases of cross-border kidnapping dwindled in the next few years as Mao stopped the Red Guards movement, or at least they have not been appearing in the newspapers anymore. So the Zhang Ngao case and other incidents of kidnapping exposed the ambiguities of the residential statuses of the people who worked in the sea. Law enforcement was difficult and sparse. Even though many technically had their homes in Laofao, their rights for government protection were constantly put into question because they were always on the fringe of Hong Kong borders. There had been cases of kidnapping both in the sea territories and near the land border in the 1960s and 1970s. These cases show that the Hong Kong government could not be counted on for protection in areas outside of city center. In addition, territorial waters should be seen as a distinctive geographical category. Unlike land borders, the definition of sea borders are often ambiguous. Moreover, many fishermen and oystermen travel back and forth between the sea territories of mainland China and Hong Kong constantly, so there was no documentation of their actual whereabouts. To many of those who had experienced the escape or who had witnessed fellow refugees dying on the journey, the reports of dead bodies and kidnapping reinforced their traumatic memories of running away from the CCP. This trauma was not so much centered on the actual physical abuses, such as arbitrary imprisonment or torture, but rather it was the psychological threats that people felt and the sufferings that they witnessed. The journeys of those who made the attempts to escape to Hong Kong illegally were driven by and filled with the fear of dying. And yet, even for the ones who had survived the journey, continued to be haunted by the media about the ones who were less fortunate. To these people who ended up in Hong Kong, they chose to leave because the life in China was too difficult. After they came to Hong Kong, through these narratives about dead bodies, they realized that the CCP was also not too hesitant to kill or abandon them. The dead bodies were uncanny reminders through which the public in Hong Kong was subjected to a kind of violence that was damaging, not so much in its execution, but in its spectacle. The media coverage and the propaganda materials with gruesome details and images make for a much more thorough spectacle of terror than the acts themselves. Last but not least, terror had been a part of daily life for Hong Kong residents in general, and the people in the fisheries in particular, during and after the Cultural Revolution. These horror stories of the sea sparked fear about the other side of the border. At the same time, both the floating dead bodies and the kidnappings in Hong Kong territorial waters were active reminder of the political turbulence that many had left behind and triggered new fearful imaginations about what the state could do to its people behind the closed doors. Lastly, I argue that the desire for self-determination and autonomy among many Hong Kong people today did not just come from what they knew about democracy in other societies, nor was it purely the influence of British colonialism. Rather, it might have come from a deep fear and distrust of the CCP as a result of the diasporic trauma since the 1950s and 1960s. And such trauma solidified the will of the people who settled in Hong Kong to collectively resist the oppression of the Chinese Communist Party at all costs. Thank you.